Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today we're going to do a deep dive first look at the Plum Island Horror, designed by Hermann Luttmann and published by GMT Games. In this game, a massive storm has hit the east coast of the United States, causing widespread power outages and contamination in a top-secret research plant on Plum Island, just off the coast. The chemical leakages and contamination in the research plant infect the staff and turn them into a mutant horde of zombies. Your job in this solo cooperative game where you fight against this zombie horde is to protect yourself, save the citizens on the island, and in turn save the entire known world from the zombie plague.
Couple things as we get started. In the intro I called them zombies. Well, the enemies and the monsters, if you would, function much like zombies do function, I think. The game calls them horrors, and that's what we're going to call them going forward in this first look. Second thing, this game, if you've seen the Most Wanted in 2024 video that's up on the channel, this is one of my top 10 most wanted games for 2024. So very excited that this one has arrived. It'll be the first one of those 10 games to take a look at in this year. Let's take a look at the back of the box now and see some of the general overview components. It's important to note the players here 1 to 4. This is a solo or cooperative game. If you're playing with more than one person, you're each going to be taking one of the 6 factions in the game and working to defeat the horrors. So basically this is a cooperative or solo game that you're playing. Playing time says 45 minutes per player. That feels about right. It definitely feels like a single sitting game. I do wonder about the solo mode if you're playing it by yourself, because as a solo player, you're going to be controlling 2 factions. I get a sense as a solo player, it's probably going to take more like a 2-player time, so maybe more hour and a half to play through the whole thing, but that remains to be seen until we kind of play the game and get it on the table and things like that. Complexity I'll talk a little bit more about as we dig into the rules, but this feels right to me. And then solitaire suitability, it's high, 9 out of 9. I give it a 10 out of 10 on my scale. This is a dedicated solitaire game with an entire solitaire system to run the horrors and all their movements and actions in the game. So most definitely a very high solitaire rating. So this is a big 3-inch box in thickness, and there is packed with stuff. There's a lot of stuff to look at here. Production values on this one is very, very high. I love, as we're looking here at the rulebook, and we'll start with that, there are 2 documents here, the reference guide and the rulebook. I love kind of the comic book style and flair to it, like issue number and the month and 10 cents, this kind of old school comic book flair and design to the rulebook. But before we jump in and take a look at the rulebook in general, one thing that I really like with this, so we've got a rulebook and then we've got a reference guide, and we'll talk a little bit about the reference guide when we take a closer look at it. But I think this is brilliant because so many times learning the game and then playing the game, you almost need different documentation. This game seems to acknowledge that by having a rule book that's going to help you learn the game, and then the reference guide that's going to be something you can refer to after you've read the rules and start to playing and just need to look up something quickly. This is brilliant, and we'll take a look at both of these as we go forward. But to dig into the rules in general, there are 36 pages, I believe, of rules here, 32 pages of rules. Yeah, 32-page rule book. Text is well kind of spread out in beautiful layout here. I love the graphics. I read through them last night except for a couple of last pages and things like that. But graphics are everywhere. Everything is easily explained. There's a setup process. It looks like it's going to be a little bit of a setup, probably like maybe 15 minutes to get the game set up. But everything is brilliantly explained. A lot of times graphics just enhancing stuff when they're referring to components or referring to items on the map. There's always a visual example of it. So this was just a joy to read. The writing is very clear. I love the kind of attitude the game brings to it in terms of its documentation. There's a little bit of kind of an edgy tone to the game here that's really kind of fun to explore. So yeah, rulebook is marvelous. I think, again, as I mentioned in the intro there, I'm going to give this game a complexity rating of 3.5 out of 10. There is some meat here. A couple things too to talk about. One thing that I want to look at as we're digging through this game, I want to talk about the depth in the game, because there is only the one scenario. And so one of the questions I have as I'm looking at this is, to what degree is this game going to be replayable? Is it going to be a game that you're going to play a couple times and then not really come back to? And with that, I think the rulebook gives us some indications here in terms of what that's the case. So one of the things I'm looking at is depth of gameplay. And here's an idea, a list of all the different things that the player can do in their turn. So the player can move. They can do ranged combat or close combat, crowd control, evacuate civilians, because you're going to be trying to save civilians in the city, repair things, build your compound. If you're in specific locations, you can forage, decontaminate, or search. You can also heal. There are special actions that are on each of the, not each, but many of the individual soldiers that you're kind of fighters and characters that you're going to be controlling in the game have special actions that are tied directly to them. And then lastly, there is a reposition action that you're going to have as a follow-on action that's part of the game turn as well. So just kind of listing up all of these different actions that we can see here, there's a depth of gameplay here that leads me to believe, yeah, this is going to be something you can replay and explore a lot of different strategies as to what strategies you're going to emphasize as the game is going on. Let's take a look now, though, at the reference guide. There are 3 parts to it. One is really kind of the map and components and stuff like that. Then we've got special units and an example of play. So this is kind of referring to all the different special units that are in the game. Now, we'll take a look as we see factions and counters, what we're talking about with that. But then a nice long example of play that has graphics to kind of illustrate some of the different things when necessary. And then we get to the back half of this. This is 36 pages, by the way. As we get to the back half of it here, we've got a glossary that really kind of in kind of a synthesized form explains a lot of the different elements and different things that you're going to be using in the game. So again, kind of teaming between these two things. Use the rulebook to learn the game. Then as you're playing the game, I think you're going to be able to use this reference guide to go back in and kind of get kind of abbreviated explanations of all the things you kind of understand, but you might need to look something up in order to be able to execute it correctly. So I really like this because I do think oftentimes it's really hard to create documentation that does both of these things. So having learning and reference in 2 different documents, marvelous, really, really nice. Let's jump in now and take a look at our counters. Altogether, there are 300 counters in the game. It sounds like a lot, but only 100 of them really are unit counters. The rest, about 200 or so, are marker counters, something similar to what we're looking at right here. And what we're looking at first right now, these are the tokens. The turns, and to kind of explain a little bit about the structure of the game is 9 turns long. Each turn is 3 hours, so the game spans 3 days, and there are 2 day turns and 1 night turn. And there are some unique characteristics about night turns when you play those there. For each turn, there's going to be 8 tokens in a bag, and you're going to pull out that token to see what faction or whether the enemy horrors are going to be activated during that token pull, during that particular phase. So we can see here there are 6 factions on the top of this, 6 different factions. They each have 2 tokens. I'll talk about that in a moment. But basically in a turn there's going to be 4 faction tokens, 3 of these fate tokens, and then this kind of doom token here, which I think can trigger all sorts of bad things. And basically the way it works is if you're playing a 4-faction game, there's going to be 1 of each in there. However, it recommends that if you're playing a solitaire version of the game, a solo, just by yourself, you're going to pick 2 factions, and each of your 2 factions will activate twice. So for example, you took the constabulary here, the police, and then the Islanders Athletic Club, you would put 2 of those tokens each, and you're going to be playing those twice in a turn. So down here we have some markers for combat and action use. All of the tokens here are printed on both sides for clarity and ease of use. Let's jump in and take a look now at our standees. So there are 6 factions in the game, and we can see here the counters for the 6 factions. And there's also here unique horrors. So these are kind of unique standee horrors that may or may not spawn in any particular game. And these units have all kinds of characteristics and skills and ratings. I'll talk about those in a minute. But to kind of get at the idea of how replayable and how deep is the game. You know, in any given game, if you're playing it 4-player, you're going to use 4 of the 6 factions. And all of these factions have unique characteristics and skills. So part of the way that the game is talking about it's going to play out is that you have to work together. So you want to use a particular faction's strength to its advantage and compensate so that you're working together as a team to take advantage of your faction strengths and minimize their weaknesses. Also down here, these unique horrors are going to spawn in some games. They're going to be triggered by an event card, and so they may or may not spawn in here in terms of game. You might play a whole game and not see any of them. You might play a whole game and see 3 or 4. So I think getting at the idea that even though there's only one scenario, the fact that there's a multiplicity of factions that you can play with each with their own unique characteristics, and the fact that there's kind of these unique horrors that can spawn into a game, I feel like every game is going to feel a little bit different, and that's going to add a lot to the depth and replayability. Just to give an idea on what some of these numbers stand for on the counters, let's walk through John Deere, who comes from the Island Athletic Club. We can see him on his lawnmower there with the shovel. The top left is the close combat rating. You may see a number beside that is that ranged combat. So there's both, again, close combat and ranged combat in the game. Below that we have the admin rating. This it kind of affects how many civilians you can kind of control in doing different actions in the game. Underneath that we have a bravery rating. Then the bottom two numbers are on foot movement, which is the 2, and then vehicular movement, which is a 3. Then on the bottom right, we have the hit points, kind of the toughness of the character, which is a 4. You may also see some of the characters have plus signs here we can look at, which is the healing, and then the flagged ones are the faction leader. So we can see that Sid Calhoun here, the coach, is the leader of the Island Athletic Club faction. Now let's take a look at the horrors here. These are all identical. These are a murder of horrors. The murder is basically the group name because that's what they do to people. And these have no stacking limit in the game. You can have an unlimited amount of them. And they represent here kind of a swarm, if you would, of enemies. So the player characters generally represent one person, one individual. These represent swarms of horrors. Next up, let's take a look at another counter. We've got some markers here. So we've got exhausted for a location, damaged. One of the ways the game has some variability in it is during the setup, you're going to roll a die. We're going to pick a fate card that's got a 1 to 6 number on it. That's basically going to dictate to what degree various structures in the game are damaged at the start of the game. So that's another way that even though there's only one scenario, you're going to get some different starting conditions in the game that's going to impact how the game plays out too. One of the factors, one of the ways, there are 4 ways you can lose the game and only one way you can win the game. Now you win the game by not triggering any of the loss conditions and basically surviving all the 3 days. But one of the ways you can lose the game is not saving enough citizens. You can see these citizens tokens on the left hand side that have a 1 to 3 on them. You have to save 26 citizens in the game in order to be able to win. So even if you survive the whole night and kind of take care of yourselves and do well and you make it to that end of that 3rd day, it's selfish and reckless if you don't save enough civilians, and so you're deemed to be a failure to humanity unless you save enough civilians. Now we'll also see here, these are some NPC standee characters, and these are some NPC characters to a lesser degree. These are triggered in largely by search events, and we'll talk about those when we look at the cards in the game. So again, giving an idea of some of the variety that could happen. You know, some of these characters are going to trigger into games, and some of them aren't going to trigger into games, depending upon which kind of search cards you pick. And any one of the player factions can control these in the course of their turn. So they kind of become like almost auxiliary, they're called in the game non-player characters, NPCs. They become almost like auxiliary forces that you can use to help reinforce your faction. Lastly, we have one last sheet that's mainly counters. Supplies exist, so you need to feed your forces, and at nighttime you have to feed, and if you don't, they're going to take hit points. And also if you're doing ranged combat, you have to use supplies. So there's an incentive to be able to search the town. We'll talk about that when we get there in terms of searching locations and things like that. That's going to add these to your forces. So you're constantly balancing, you know, in addition to trying to just fight the horrors, you've got to kind of forage for supplies and things like that to kind of build up your forces and allow it to take out more actions. And then we have some different markers in here. We've got some pistols, Molotov cocktails that you can find. There are a number of vehicles in the game. We can see here Army Hog helicopter, Coast Guard helicopter. There's some ships that can be coming around the island as well. And these all, again, can spawn in or out depending upon what different things happen in the game, and they can get destroyed and all kinds of things. And then lastly, in this top right corner, each faction has a compound that you can build during the game where you can civilians can kind of come in and take cover. And these compounds have their own actions and strength points too. So they're kind of like a stabilized force here that can help them. They cannot move except for the paddy wagon, which is the constabulary's kind of movement here, compound as well. Damage counters, so a lot of different things in here, but again, hopefully these counters give you an idea. Again, as I'm reading this, you know, one thing you're looking for in depth and replayability is enough complexity, so there's a lot of different things to try. I think this game, judging from what I can see of the components here, it's got it covered in spades. So I think the gameplay is going to be very unique and nuanced, and I think you're going to be exploring a lot of strategies to figure out how to succeed in the game. Let's go now to our player aids. There are 3 different player aids in the game. The first is the faction mats, and so these you're going to basically have off to the side of the board. This is the one here that shows the faction mat for the unique horrors. So we've got infected Sasquatch, leper messiahs, the wild-eyed rats, murder hornets, most wanted. It looks like someone who escaped from the prison here, and then birds of prey. And each one of these has their own unique characteristics and designed to wreak havoc among your forces. And so you're going to be having this off, and this is where you track hit points for them and all the different kind of things that are there that are going on with these unique units. And again, these may or may not spawn into particular games, so it gives me a sense that, yeah, there's going to be a variety each time you play depending upon what happens. And then we have 6 mats here for the different sorry, sorry, 6 like that for the different factions in the game, and these function in much the same way. You're going to put them off to the side, and you'll be able to kind of keep track of hit points and keep track of all the things that are going on with the unit. You're storing your supplies here, if you're the constabulary, for example, other things that fall into play. And then you'll notice here in the middle of these, in these white bars here, this is where it kind of describes a lot of the unique actions that these units have. So, for example, Commander Arnie Stallion here is a SWAT team member for this. We shoot and scoot. When conducting a ranged combat action only, this unit may also move one area for free. This can be done before or after the combat resolution. So again, this is a unique feature of this unit, giving you an idea that each one of these factions has their own unique members, all of which are kind of different and possess different skills. So you really got kind of a lot of different ways. This one cracks me up. The Island Athletic Club is just so funny. We got, what is it here? Marsha and Jan Brady, the doubles tennis team. This guy, Johnny Deere, the groundskeeper. That's just, I mean, this is just funny stuff. We got a golfer and everything like that. Miguel Spitz, the swimmer. So yeah, but sorry, I get distracted a little bit, but each one of these, again, has unique characteristics that are going to do things in different ways, and each faction has its own unique kind of characteristics as well. And then, lastly, here's the mat here for the NPC units that you'll be using to track those as they come into the game as well. Two other player aids to look at. This is the all-important kind of the player mat that keeps track of the game status. So we have the turn marker up here. And again, to kind of go into that idea of the ways you can lose the game, there's one, we talked a little bit about not evacuating a number of citizens, and this is where we keep the track of that. So down here, 26, we're saved, right? A couple of ways you can lose the game in addition to, so if you don't save enough, that's one way you can lose. Another way you can lose is if the horrors get to the overrun areas, and we'll talk about that as we look at the map. Each overrun area, each area that if the horrors get to, it signifies that basically they've run over the island to a certain degree, and those are worth different points. If you lose 8 of the 8 points worth of those areas, not 8 areas, but 8 points worth of those areas, you lose the game. And lastly, there's biohazards. So these horrors can infect areas and cause infection and stuff like that, and that also determines how many of them are going to spawn. If that track ever reaches 17 or more, you've triggered another loss condition. So that's basically the third way out of the 4 that you can lose the game, and you're tracking these here. And again, we can see the turn track up here, 2 turns for the day and 1 turn for the night. And this is where you store all the biohazard cubes. There's a lot of cubes in the game, we'll show those, and then hit cubes are down here as well. And these biohazard cubes, you're pulling them out of a bag, as we shall take a look at later. Lastly, just a standard quick reference, we have the sequence of play. Another idea of the things you can be doing, this is the repair table. So certain things start broken in the game, and you want to fix those in order to get them into action. Overrun points, we talked about that, close combat and ranged combat, damage resolution. There are unique dice for the game, so we'll talk about that as we take a look at those later. And there are 3 decks of cards in the game. Let's take a look at those. The first deck here we'll take a look at is the Fate cards. And this basically, the Fate cards are largely the cards that you're going to be using to kind of keep track of the movement and the spawning of the horrors as they're coming into the game and moving around the board. And so basically each time you pull that Fate token out of the turn deck, you're going to flip one of these cards over, and then it's going to attack. You're going to basically be following these in action, where you're going to be spawning units in track 1, and we'll talk about that as we look at the game board there. There are 6 tracks in the game, and then activating units in another one there too. And some of these have different things, like reanimate means that the number of horrors in each particular stack is going to increase. And then activation here, 4, 5, and 6, that's a lot of action there. And there's also like a chaos one. So some of them do different things, but mainly these are the cards that are going to dictate how the enemy moves when their token has been pulled in the turn order. And then down the bottom you see this numbers on the bottom right, 1 to 6 and stuff like that. This is used instead when you need a 1 to 6 die roll. You're going to pick one of these cards and just use that number. And then there are times too where you're going to be either having an event card or not having event cards get pulled, and you're going to be using those to trigger those as well. So these are basically kind of your enemy monitoring and movement and control cards there. Now we have search cards. These are good largely for your forces. When you search in particular areas, you can trigger one of these cards, and you're going to flip it over, and then something unique will happen. These are really cool because they seem really, really unique. They've got a lot of different, some things are conditions and you've got options and things like that, but a lot of good things can generally happen with these. For the most part, they seem like call in an airstrike, something found in the driftwood. I think sometimes I get a sense that maybe bad things can happen. Okay, so yeah, here's one of those unique and non-player characters. Rex Kramer crawls out from under his plane's wreckage. So replace the Rex Kramer VIP civilian unit in the Old Republic airport area along with 2 supplies. So this is how he would appear in the game, giving a sense again of that depth of play, because this card might never come up in the game, right? I mean, I don't think you're going to go through the whole deck in a game. Again, not playing, I don't really know yet, but these are how these kind of unique ones are going to kind of appear. Here's one: a low-flying plane passes overhead, place the first-class passengers in the Old Republic airport, and they get some supplies and things like that too. And then we can see as well, I think this is how these larger non-player characters come in the game too. The Great Savior, place the Hero of the Day NPC unit. So he comes into the game that way. So these things do a lot of really cool things, and they're generally really, really good for your faction. So as you search things and move around the board and get these into play, good things are going to happen. However, our event cards, by and large, are the bad things. And I think these are what you pick as you pick that Doom character out. We can see already just from the first one here, death from above, right? So yeah, these are bad things, right? This is the one that spawns in one of those Standee enemies. So spawn the Birds of Play mutation Standee in the Inga Forest area. What kind of hell is this? Draw a fate number, spawn the Leper Messiah's mutation in that track's number spawning zone. So it's bringing in a lot of the bigger characters, and then other things here, like the planes can crash. Here we have engine failure. The Coast Guard helicopter unit suffers engine failure. Draw a fate number. On a 1, it crashes. On a 6, it crashes. On 2 to 5, a rough landing is flipped over to the disabled side, which I assume then would mean you'd have to repair it. Run aground, the Coast Guard cutter. So lots of different things. Social distancing. The civilians are panicked and lashing out. All player units on that track number which are currently sharing an area with a civilian unit of any type take 1 hit. So we get the idea again, the civilians are kind of acting in chaos and they start hurting your forces and things. Stormy weather approaching. And again, to get an idea of the depth, I think each game is going to play out differently depending upon, of course, the order and whether these cards come into play and the timing of these cards come into play. So even though, again, there is one scenario, my initial sense of this is that there's going to be a ton of replayability. The most of which I think is probably going to come from just the way the different factions play out and all the different things that they can do in the game. And that I think is going to be probably one of the largest factors in terms of the game's replayability. But the event cards, certainly the search cards as well, to add a lot of replayability to the game, as well as just the overall depth of the game too. Few more things to look at. I'm going to put the map off to the side for right now and just kind of briefly talk a little bit about some of these the stuff that are down in here. These are the cubes that are used for hit markers and the biohazard markers. There are 3 types of biohazard cubes. Green doesn't really impact you. Yellow, I think, causes 1 advancement on that biohazard track, and red causes 2 advancements on that. So you want to keep the red ones out of play, and you want to keep the green ones in play. And the black is for your hit markers to track the number of hits on individual units. So that's what those are for there. Then we have our bags. These are for the biohazard cubes. So as a biohazard activity gets triggered, you're going to reach into this bag and pull it out, and you're hoping for green and not hoping for red, of course. And then we have more here. This is another bag where I think you're putting the civilians in when you place them at the beginning of the game, because these civilians, the different values, and they're going to be randomly scattered across the board, giving a little bit of variety to the setup. Here we have our standees for the characters. I think that's probably self-evident. And then we have our dice, our custom dice. So the dice have 6 sides to them. 2 of them is nothing happens. 1 is the shield token, and then the other 3 are various degrees of hits that you do on the enemy. And so you're going to be basically using these in close combat and ranged combat to determine the amount of damage that's caused on a character. And lastly, let's take a look at our map. So the map here, I'll show an overview as I'm unfolding it. 22 by 34. Really thick, nice color mounted map is the standard for GMT mounted maps. So just a lot of quality in here. And we can take a look, I think, now at how some of the areas here play out in terms of gameplay. It's going to be really hard to fit this because it is a vertical facing map. But we're looking now at the north end of Plum Island. And one of the things I want to show, because this gives an idea, I think, on how gameplay is going to work. Up the top here, we can see the various tracks. So we have tracks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And by and large, horrors are going to spawn up here in these tracks, and then they're going to flow down the island. So the kind of the research facilities up here in the north part of the island, and these tracks are going to gradually get overtaken by horrors as the game progresses. Now, these white and black areas that have the black arrows, that's the path that the horrors are going to take. There's also, if you note, on the side sometimes there is a kind of a dual track. For then you're going to pull a fate number to determine which way the horrors go. They're either going to go left on a 1 or a 6, or right on a 2 or a 5. The player character, the human player character, can go through, there's also some horizontal movement areas. We can see the green arrows and things like that. But just a really rich, I love the art style and kind of the overall, just the uniqueness of this map. I could see even in the future perhaps another map gets created to create a different variety for different types of gameplay and things like that. But then gameplay is going to flow down through this. So it very much is this top down where you're trying to fight back, but there are times where the horrors can move horizontally if a certain type of event happens. So you're never really 100% sure that you can rely on horrors to stay in their track, because you could pull an event card that triggers them to move sideways and attack and things like that, causing all kinds of chaos. But there are different things here too, like we've got beaches here on the left-hand side, beaches down here on both sides of the island. And those are areas that can have special events that happen to them and things like that. One of the other things to point out too, we talked about how there are location actions in the game, and we can see here, for example, on Carrie's Corner, there are different actions that can be taken. This is the forage action, which means you're hoping to find supplies. Then we have a search action, which is going to be pulling over one of those green cards. And then lastly, like if we look here on Pearl East, there's this decontamination one. You can do that to kind of decontaminate and lower the level of decontamination in the areas. So that fights back against that kind of the growth in the biohazard track. So again, you're constantly trying to balance things like supplies, decontamination, finding good things, triggering good events, being safe, protecting and shepherding civilians off the map and stuff like that, and getting them to safety, all the while you're trying to not get yourself killed. Because we did mention the 3 of the 4 ways you can lose the game. The 4th way you can lose the game is if any faction in the game runs out of units, loses all of its 5 units. If that happens in the game is lost by everybody. So you have to make sure that at some point in time you at least have 1 character left that's active in the game. I also want to point out here on the right hand side, we talked a little bit about overrun. So the Great South Bridge is actually an overrun zone. So if the zombies overtake this, that gives them actually 6 points in that kind of track where you only need 8. So each of these areas are worth more points. The Great South Bay Bridge is critical. It's worth a ton of points. So not losing that to the horrors, it seems like it's of pretty significant importance. And then if we look down here on the bottom of the map, we can see the other main 6 overrun areas. So this basically signifies that the horrors have gotten all the way down the map. They've gone through all these different areas and they have overrun the island. And each one of these has a point value. And again, if you get to 8 or more, it's game over. The horrors have overrun the island and you have lost. And there we have it, the Plum Island Horror. Not having played it, I don't want to overstate things, but I am very excited to play it. This one looks like it's got a lot of charm to it and a lot of really fun gameplay. Also, I will mention too, I just noticed yesterday that it looks like GMT is kind of investing in this one because there is already an expansion pack up on their P500 system to add more gameplay, more factions, more cards, more everything to the game. So it looks like this is one they think is going to be a pretty strong game going forward in time. At some point in time, I want to post some gameplay of this game, but in the meantime, if you want to see something that is roughly similar to the Plum Island Horror, I would guide you to our full replay of Lanzerath Ridge from Dan Versen Games, which covers the defense by a US recon unit against the onslaught of German paratroopers at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge.